This is Historic Blah, where the past comes alive in minutes. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and comment your city. I want to see where our history lovers are watching from. Story 1. The Olive Tree Tax of Athens. You probably don't think about how many olive trees were growing around ancient Athens. Nor would it seem important to note that at one point in the 5th century BCE, someone had to count them. But in the quiet alleys beyond the bustling agora, this is exactly what preoccupied a group of civic scribes for the better part of a decade. Let's go back to a time before silver coins carried the image of Athena's owl, when olives weren't just a crop but a political headache. The olive tree, more than a plant. The olive tree was sacred to the goddess Athena. According to legend, she gifted the tree to the people of Athens in a divine contest with Poseidon. While Poseidon offered a saltwater spring, Athena gave the city an olive tree on the Acropolis. They chose her, of course. Salt water doesn't make good soup. From then on, the olive was not just a food source or oil supplier, it was a sacred object. Cutting one down was punishable by death or exile. But at the same time, the city needed to know who owned what and how much tax should be collected from them. This tension between religious reverence and administrative necessity set the stage for a quiet but significant drama. Meet Philostratus the clerk. You, standing beside Philostratus the scribe, would not think he was anyone of importance. He had thin ankles, uneven sandals, and always carried a weighted pouch of lead tablets. His job, not to debate philosophy or vote in the assembly, but to measure olive yields per parcel and record discrepancies in root counts. Philostratus was one of dozens dispatched by the city council to conduct what was arguably the earliest agricultural audit in Mediterranean history. Every plot had to be registered, and each tree tagged not for veneration, but for taxation. He carried a small bronze stylus and a wax tablet to avoid mistakes. Mistakes meant fines. Fines meant angry landowners. Angry landowners meant the possibility of a fistfight. So Philostratus walked carefully. The survey begins. The operation began in Eleusis, where temple lands were thick with gnarled trunks and generous fruit. The temple priests, of course, argued their land should be exempt. After all, Demeter had once stepped foot here. Did the city really want to tax the footprints of gods? The answer was yes, if those footprints contained 4,000 olive trees yielding hundreds of amphorae of oil each year. The city council was clever, though. They didn't tax the temples directly. Instead, they taxed the transport of oil out of religious precincts. It was, as one official said, a secular levy on divine logistics. Philostratus wrote that one down. He liked the phrasing. Olive oil economics. Athens wasn't a sprawling empire just yet, but it was beginning to spread its influence across the Aegean. And olive oil, fragrant, long-lasting, and versatile, was a major export. What's less remembered is that the olive oil trade wasn't glamorous. It required hundreds of clay amphorae, slippery loading docks, ropes that frayed under weight, and dock workers who often argued about whose turn it was to shovel olive pits off the gangplanks. Behind it all was the system. How much oil came from where, how much tax was owed, and how it would be enforced. The average landholder might own 30 to 50 trees. A wealthy aristocrat could have 200, but owning trees meant being watched. Tax scribes like Philostratus kept a record of yield averages, and if you harvested far more than your reported count, well, someone would notice. There was even a phrase in common use among olive growers: don't get seen with full hands at dusk, a warning that too much success was a dangerous look. Olive tree disputes and theft. Unlike grapes or barley, olive trees could live for hundreds of years. That meant land disputes often went back generations. Philostratus's own log from the year 459 BCE records at least 9 cases of root infringement, where neighboring landowners argued over whose tree was growing on whose soil. More complicated were ghost trees, ones that were never taxed, possibly dead, but possibly still alive. There were even tree thefts. Imagine that. A group of men sneaking out at midnight to dig up a young olive sapling and carry it 3 fields over. It took planning, tools, and silence. And if they were caught, well, punishments varied, but exile was not uncommon. Nobody wanted to be the man who moved the goddess gift. Philostratus recorded one such incident in the hills outside Marathon. A young farmer named Ewings insisted that a tree his neighbor claimed had migrated during a storm was in fact carried there. He swore by Hermes himself he saw it moved. The council ruled against him. There was no precedent for tree kidnapping. The tree stayed put. Ewings paid a fine and never harvested from that plot again. What made the audit possible? What's fascinating, or maybe sleep-inducing, is how deeply methodical the Athenians were. They used knotted cords to measure field width, tally sticks to record tree count, and styluses for record-keeping. It was dull work, repetitive, but from this came policy. One of the few surviving fragments from the Athenian olive register shows how categories were split. Mature trees bearing fruit. Mature trees unproductive. Saplings under 4 feet. Trees with blight or rot. Trees belonging to temple lands. Trees pending dispute. Every year, these lists were reviewed and updated. And while we remember the great dramas of Euripides or the battle lines of Marathon, this kind of mundane record-keeping did more to shape everyday life than any epic war. Religious conflict and civic order. The olive tree, as sacred as it was, became the center of bureaucratic conflict. Religious conservatives argued that no mortal had the right to weigh the goddess' bounty. Reformers countered that Athena gave the olive precisely so it could be used and counted wisely. One speech fragment from the orator Lysistron, not to be confused with Aristophanes, fictional Lysistrata, makes a plea for moderation. Let the tree be honored, but let its oil be counted. Even the gods do not ignore the counting of stars. It's not a great line, but it stuck. By 447 BCE, the olive audit had become law, and landholders were required to submit annual updates. This may not sound thrilling, but it marks one of the earliest known forms of civic agricultural regulation based on divine origin myths, a strange fusion of the sacred and the spreadsheet. Philostratus' small rebellion. After 2 decades in service, Philostratus did something remarkable. He stopped counting. Not entirely, but in one of his last entries he wrote simply, Field 67, olive count unchanged, oil yield unknown. Owner says the trees are tired, so am I. Nobody punished him. The year after, the audit rules were revised again. Farmers were allowed to estimate yield based on prior years, reducing the burden on both themselves and the scribes. It was the beginning of trust, not a huge one, but notable. And it all started with a man and a field and some trees. When we last left Philostratus and his quiet act of rebellion, Athens was just beginning to transition its olive audit from a meticulous scribal practice to a broader policy of civic trust. But what happens when trust breaks down? What happens when tax becomes empire? To understand this, you must walk the gravel paths outside Athens, through groves increasingly surrounded by low stone walls, not to keep animals out, but to keep eyes out. The olive tree audit, once a local affair of careful counts and cautious disputes, was about to be weaponized. From audit to asset. By the mid-5th century BCE, Athens was flush with ambition. Silver flowed in from Laurian's mines, and tribute poured into the city from the islands and cities of the Delian League. But olive oil was becoming the quiet bloodstream of the Athenian economy. It filled amphorae bound for Egypt, Thrace, and the western colonies. It lit lamps, anointed athletes, and sealed trade deals. And unlike mined silver or imported grain, oil could be locally controlled and grown. so the city began to treat its groves as strategic resources. A new council decree, circa 443 BCE, reclassified all high-yield olive estates as strategic dendrota, strategic trees. These trees, once part of ordinary property, were now state interest flora. It was a clumsy phrase but a clear shift in tone. Landowners were still allowed to harvest and sell the oil, but taxes increased sharply. New inspectors were appointed, this time from the naval offices, not the scribal class. And suddenly, the olive audit was not just about revenue, it was about funding fleets. The oil and the ores. Each trireme in the Athenian navy required maintenance, crew, provisions, and importantly oil. Sailors needed it for light, for treating wood, and even for preserving food. The more oil available, the less Athens needed to import from abroad. By 440 BCE, estimates suggest that nearly 18% of olive oil taxed within Attica was funneled directly into state use. The state didn't always seize the oil itself, but it taxed the oil trade so heavily that the money it generated could fund naval expeditions in the Aegean. This is where resistance began to simmer. Farmers were suddenly being taxed not for what they grew, but for what their oil could be used for. If their plot was near a strategic port or inland route, the levy was higher. These weren't just farmers anymore, they were producers of potential. The city didn't call it a war tax, but many knew that's what it was becoming. Subtle resistance. Not all revolts are bloody. Some start with olives falling silently into baskets that are never declared. Across the hills near Piraeus and into the fertile ridges of Laurium, landowners began understating yields. Some even planted fast-growing fig trees among the olives to disrupt the inspections. Fig leaves could be thick, and the added shade made accurate counting harder. One account from a scribe named Niceron tells of an entire estate where the trees had been intentionally pruned to look sickly. "They bear little now," the owner had said. "The goddess has turned her face." In truth, the oil was being stored in unmarked amphorae and traded privately. The emergence of these silent groves, as they were later called, created a kind of gray market for olive oil, one the city couldn't fully control. Legal backlash. In response, Athens passed the Olive Fraud Decree in 438 BCE. The law empowered magistrates to impose summary fines and temporary land seizure for suspected fraud in oil declarations. A new title was created, the Eleignomen, literally, the olive knower. These officials could arrive unannounced, count trees, demand to see yield records, and even inspect pressed stones and residue to estimate whether someone had pressed more oil than reported. And yet they were deeply unpopular. In one preserved fragment of graffiti found etched on the inside of a water cistern, a citizen scrawled, "The Eleignomen drinks oil and bleeds olives." The phrase caught on, and olive inspectors were soon viewed not as civic agents but as parasitic enforcers. Philostratus' legacy. Though he had retired, Philostratus's notebooks were still used by junior scribes, and in one case, a newly appointed Eleignomen cited his work while prosecuting a farmer near a charney for underreporting. But the landowner argued something curious. "The count of the trees may be exact, but the will of the tree is not. I cannot tax what the tree refuses to give." It was the beginning of a philosophical argument that nature, not the state, determined yield, and that taxation should account for variance. While the courts didn't buy the argument in full, it led to a shift in how yield was evaluated. Instead of flat taxes per tree, inspectors were instructed to calculate average yield bands per region and assess tax proportionally. It was bureaucratic, it was messy, but it was fairer. Subversion in the press houses. Still, resistance continued in quieter ways. Some estate owners began adding other materials to their press houses to disguise true oil output: sand to increase pulp volume, charcoal to alter scent. While these adulterations made the oil less valuable, they reduced taxable yield on paper. Others pressed oil at night and stored it in broken pots buried in dry wells, only to trade it later under other cities' stamps. One scribe noted that between 436 and 432 BCA, no fewer than 11 amphorae from Athenian groves were found in Megarian ports with Corinthian marks. Smuggling, low stakes, quiet, but enough to make the city suspicious of its own farmers. A city at odds with itself. What had begun as a civic inventory had now become an economic battleground. Inspectors were chased out of fields with dogs. Scribes stopped wearing city insignia in rural districts. One official disguised himself as a potter just to enter a contested estate undetected. And all the while, Athens kept building ships. The irony is unavoidable. A democratic polis, proud of its debates and theater and temples, was now surveilling farmers to extract a resource gifted, according to myth, by a goddess for the city's peace and prosperity. Olive trees were no longer just sacred or useful, they were symbolic. Owning many meant status. Owning too many meant suspicion. The case of the Theophronides. In 431 BCE, a landowner named Theophronides was accused of deliberate underreporting. His estate had yielded twice the expected amphorae, yet his taxes had remained the same for 3 years. Instead of denying the claim, Theophronides appealed to the council with a written speech, unusual at the time, in which he stated, "The trees give as they will, 1 year bitter, the next generous. If you chase them too hard, they sour. I have given what was owed, no more. Let the olives fall where they may." The council fined him anyway, but the speech was remembered. Fragments of it were later referenced in rhetorical schools. Theophronides became a minor folk hero in the countryside. His name was used in coded trade markings for oil sold without documentation, T-grade, as it was known, toward a fragile peace. As Athens entered the early stages of the Peloponnesian War, internal tensions cooled not from resolution, but from reprioritization. With resources stretched and citizens conscripted, the city eased enforcement of the olive audit. Taxes were still collected, but with less rigor. The office of the eleagnomen was reduced in size, and many of its duties handed back to local demes. The groves, for a time, were left alone. It was a tacit understanding. Athens needed loyalty more than it needed precise yields, and farmers, in turn, were more willing to contribute when they felt less hunted. Philostratus was long dead by then, but his quiet observation from decades earlier still rang true. Trust is a stronger oil than the tree itself. By the time the Peloponnesian War ended in 404 BCE, Athens was nearly unrecognizable. The long walls had been torn down, its navy was shattered, and the once proud city of Pericles had become a humbled polis under Spartan watch. But not all ruins were made of stone. Across Attica, olive groves stood in eerie silence. Some were scorched, others abandoned. Many had been cut down by Spartan forces, not for conquest but for strategy to break the city's food chain, trade network, and identity. Athens could rebuild its walls. It could eventually rebuild its fleet. But the groves, those would take generations. A landscape of stumps. Historical sources differ on just how many trees were lost during the war, but estimates suggest as much as 40% of cultivated olive land was destroyed or rendered unproductive due to conflict, neglect, or deliberate sabotage. The state archives, once filled with tidy entries of yields, trees, and disputes, now showed entire fields marked with a single phrase, "Keen Cora, empty land." For the returning farmers, it was not only a loss of income, but of identity. Olive trees were often planted by a father for his grandchildren. Their long lives meant the groves were living heirlooms. Their loss felt like a family line severed. The post-war years were not marked by revolution or rebellion. They were marked by silence. The soil had gone quiet. The audit's quiet death. No decree was ever issued ending the olive audit, but in practice, it vanished. The office of the Eleagnomen was not renewed after 402 BCE. The city had more pressing concerns: restoring food supplies, repairing infrastructure, and surviving the delicate balance of power under Spartan oversight. What few clerks remained in the olive registry simply stopped updating the ledgers. Some tried to repurpose the documents for grain assessments or property claims, but most were left to gather dust. Philostratus's ledgers were eventually archived in the Temple of Theseus, where they became curiosity items, relics of a different Athens. Bureaucratic fossils. The tax system that once sparked disputes and subtle rebellions had ended, not with a vote, but with irrelevance. The farmers return. Yet amid the ashes, resilience took root. Farmers who returned to their land began planting again, not because they were ordered to, but because they needed to eat. Olive trees take years to mature, but some wild varieties had survived. Saplings were cut and grafted. New trees were planted in spirals to ward off soil erosion. Temples offered cuttings from sacred groves. Even Sparta, perhaps eager to appear merciful, allowed Athenian farmers to retrieve tools and seeds from previously seized land. The state, unable to enforce taxes, instead offered small grants of land use rights in exchange for pledges of loyalty. It was less administration, more negotiation. Athens had learned the limits of bureaucracy. And in this freer soil, new groves slowly rose. A different kind of record. Interestingly, it was not scribes or taxmen who resumed the olive counts, but poets and philosophers. In a quiet garden on the outskirts of the city, a man named Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle, began documenting plant life. Around 323 BCE, in his inquiry into plants, he describes the growth patterns of olive trees, their soils and diseases. It is, in effect, the first botanical textbook of the Western world. And though it never once mentions Philostratus or the olive audits, Theophrastus's work carries the torch of that earlier civic curiosity, not for tax, not for war, but for knowledge. In his descriptions, he notes, "The olive does not thrive when watched too closely, nor does it fail when left in silence. It remembers its own way." It was a statement of biological wisdom, but also a quiet political truth. The age of surveillance had passed. Observation had become study. The olive tree was no longer a number. It was a subject. Legacy of a forgotten policy. By the Hellenistic period, olive oil was again a major export of Athens. Amphorae bearing the atheta stamp, a mark of Athenian origin, were found as far as Gaul and Egypt. But there was no return to the tree-by-tree audits. Instead, taxes were levied at ports, through merchant licenses and guild contributions. The groves, once fiercely monitored, were left to the care of landowners, temples, and time. In fact, later writers mocked the old audits. An orator from 2nd century BCE, mocking his political rival, said, "He counts olives like an Eleagnomen and speaks like a dried fig." It became shorthand for useless precision. The olive tax had gone from sacred duty to a bureaucratic joke. But buried within the satire was memory. Because even if the audits failed, they were the first attempt in recorded European history to systematize agriculture with civic oversight. They were imperfect, unjust at times, but undeniably ambitious. They were, in short, boring history that mattered. The final account. An inscription discovered in 1884 in the ruins of an old deme hall near Laurium reads, "Here stood the trees of Callistratos, who planted them when the land was dust, and drank from them when the city stood again." There's no surviving record of Callistratos' yields. No stylus marks, no tax assessments, no fines. Just that stone and the grove long gone. But the story it tells is clear. That boring history is still human history. That recovery often comes not with fanfare, but with roots. And that even the quietest parts of a civilization, the trees, the ledgers, the overlooked clerks shape its survival. And so the olive tree audit of Athens faded, not in drama, but in the gentle erosion of need. Not every history ends in fire or revolution. Some simply grow old, get pruned, and sprout anew in another age. Story 2. How Demeter invented crop rotation by accident. There are grand myths about Demeter, goddess of grain, mother of Persephone, bringer of the harvest. But this is not one of them. This story begins not with divine proclamations or golden wheat fields, but with a very ordinary problem. A patch of land in central Boeotia that simply refused to grow anything for 7 years straight. If you were a farmer in the ancient world, this was not just a nuisance. It was a threat to your survival. And in the shadow of myth, behind the rituals and hymns, a practical crisis unfolded, one that led, by accident and necessity, to the earliest signs of crop rotation. Not through enlightenment, but through exhaustion. The Shrine of Dry Earth. About 70 stadia northwest of Thebes, there once stood a small shrine to Demeter pro-Erosia, Demeter of the pre-planting. It was not a grand temple, more of a sheltered altar surrounded by parched soil, known locally as Zerogia, the dry place. For years, local farmers believed the soil was cursed. No barley would rise, lentils withered, even flax turned pale and stringy. The priests blamed impiety, of course. Too little sacrifice, too many careless plowings. One year, they even banned the use of bronze tools during the harvest season, hoping that Demeter was offended by metal. It didn't help. Then, in the 6th year of famine, something odd happened. A farmer named Menalx, too poor to buy new barley seed, planted beans instead, a desperation move. He expected nothing. But to his surprise, the beans sprouted. Not just sprouted, flourished. His neighbors laughed at him until they saw the pods. Menalx called it a miracle, but the miracle was nitrogen. Soil and the science they didn't know. We now know legumes like beans and lentils fix nitrogen into the soil, enriching it for later crops. But ancient farmers didn't know this. They only observed outcomes. Still, even without understanding the mechanics, Menalx and his peers began to adjust. The following year, 3 farmers planted chickpeas where barley had failed. Then came fava beans, then lentils again. Within 3 years, the land was usable again, not rich, not perfect, but no longer dead. It wasn't yet crop rotation as we understand it. There were no charts or schedules, just cautious adaptation, observational farming. And over time, this patch of Boeotia became known as the land that learned. Enter the temple recorders. At this time, temples did more than pray. They also kept ledgers. The priests of Demeter pro-Erosia began noting which farmers were planting what and where. One scribe, Demetrios, compiled a clay tablet with seed symbols, a kind of early planting log. In it, he drew alternating rows: barley, lentils, fallow, beans. In one surviving fragment, found in a cistern near the altar, he scrawled, "Let not the soil be worked the same each season, lest it remember its burden and resent the plow." It's not quite science, but it's close. From this accidental experiment grew a quiet revolution, the rotation of crops not out of wisdom, but out of desperation. And all of it under the watchful eyes of a goddess who, ironically, was believed to demand sameness in ritual. Religious flexibility in a rigid cult. The cult of Demeter was deeply traditional. Every year, the Thesmophoria ritual reenacted the same rites, used the same sacrificial offerings, even reburied the same decayed pig remains to fertilize sacred earth. And yet, at this little shrine in Boeotia, something different was happening. When the farmers saw results from changing crops, the priests initially resistant adapted the ritual. In the festival's second phase, they introduced a symbolic bean offering alongside the barley cakes. It was seen not as replacing the old grain, but complementing it. One priest declared, "Demeter does not change, but we change how we honor her." This flexibility, rare among Greek cults, made the Boeotian shrine unusual. It became a center not just of worship, but of agricultural consultation. The spread of an idea. Word traveled slowly in ancient Greece, but practical success always found ears. By 510 BCE, farmers near Tanagra and Thespiae were reportedly rotating their fields, planting alternating legumes and grains. Temple officials from Eleusis visited the site at Zerogia to observe the practice, though they remained skeptical. One Eleusinian scribe reportedly said, "They treat the land like a wine cup, refilling it with whatever remains. This is not divine order but guesswork." Even so, a few years later, similar planting patterns began showing up in the records of eastern Attica. Was it proof that crop rotation had taken hold? Not definitively, but it points to a subtle cultural shift, that farmers were beginning to treat land as responsive, not just sacred, something that could be managed, not merely obeyed. And the goddess, she stayed silent. The field trials of Hala. Perhaps the strongest evidence for the spread of the idea comes from Halae, a coastal town in Locris with a modest temple to Demeter Thesmophoros. Clay tablets found in a nearby farmhouse describe field turning, a practice of dividing land into thirds. Barley or wheat, lentils or beans, left fallow, lightly grazed. Every year the fields rotated, a rudimentary system, no soil tests, no compost charts, but consistent. A tablet dated to 487 BCE includes the line, "Let the goddess be fed in three voices, so she will not go hoarse with hunger." It's poetic but layered. The three voices likely referred to the rotating cycles, a metaphor blending divine hunger with soil exhaustion. And here again, we see the accidental genius of ordinary farmers. They didn't have chemistry, but they had memory, observation, and necessity. Accidental innovation, lasting change. Historians often look for big names: Solon, Pericles, Hippocrates. But in this case, the innovation came from below. Peasants reacting to bad harvests, shifting seeds, experimenting in dirt while scribes took notice. Demeter was never credited officially. There was no state decree on soil management. But by the end of the 5th century BCE, across central Greece, farmers were increasingly rotating crops. What began as a field that wouldn't yield became a culture that began to learn slowly, fitfully, and without knowing why it worked. Which raises a question. If they discovered crop rotation without science, what else did they discover by accident? By now, the farmers of Boeotia, Locris, and parts of Attica had stumbled into a pattern, a way of treating the land that preserved its fertility longer and reduced the painful cycle of feast and famine. The fields, for centuries treated as passive gifts from Demeter, were becoming something else entirely, systems to be managed. But what happens when tradition meets practicality? When sacred farming becomes experimental? This section explores the murky middle ground, the slow shift from divine instruction to folk science, and how a goddess once associated solely with grain came to be honored through a rotating trinity of crops. Knowledge without theory. Let's be clear, there were no Greek treatises on nitrogen fixation. Farmers did not analyze soil acidity or microbial health. Instead, they relied on observation and memory stored not in scrolls but in oral records, ledgers scratched into clay, and generational wisdom passed over fences and through festivals. At the shrine of Demeter Pro-Erosia, temple scribes began noticing something. The fields that rotated crops not only yielded more, but were also more resistant to what they called cetos nosos, grain sickness. This was likely a reference to fungal infections, mold, or depleted nutrients leading to poor growth. The scribes began to assign coded marks to fields. Delta, Dionysia rich, fertile, untroubled. Xi, Xerodia dry, risky. Gamma, Glycia unusually sweet or high yield. Phi, Thinun declining in quality. Within a generation, these markings first used for ritual planning and temple harvests found their way into agricultural planning by landholders. The codification of land quality had begun. A ritual begins to chain. Demeter's rituals were famously unchanging, but change arrived, not through rebellion but slow integration. At the autumnal festival in Xerodia around 478 BCE, a curious new practice was introduced. Alongside the traditional pelanos, barley cake, offering, a second platter of lentils was presented not as a replacement, but as a companion dish. Some said it was to soothe Demeter's mood. In temple inscriptions, a new title appears: Demeter Trisacia, Demeter of threefold gifts. Most historians agree this was an adaptation to match the new planting pattern: grain, legume, and fallow. And yet, to avoid accusations of innovation, a dangerous thing in religious Athens, priests insisted this was an ancient name rediscovered. A convenient fiction, but one that allowed change to masquerade as continuity. Farmers take the lead. In a land where religious officials often dictated agricultural practice, it was the opposite in Xerodia and Hali. Farmers were the innovators. Men like Menalcas, once mocked for planting beans, became minor celebrities. In one surviving court record from 473 BCE, a farmer named Fradman defends himself in a land dispute by citing the rotation wisdom of Menalcas. It was not a legal precedent, but it carried weight. More curiously, farmers began trading rotation advice as barter. In one fragmentary letter found in a burial site in Thespiae, a tenant farmer writes, "If you send me your chickpea ratio, I will give you my plan for grazing after harvest. Both served the goddess and both fed my children." This was not science, but it was knowledge exchange. And through this exchange, regional variations in rotation developed. In the drier coastal zones, lentils were preferred. In upland areas, fava beans. Patterns emerged, data of a kind accumulated. Skepticism in the cities. Back in Athens, elite landowners viewed this folk wisdom with mixed feelings. Some adopted rotation cautiously, citing lower slave labor costs and more stable yields. Others dismissed it as countryside myth. The Athenian agronomist Meton, known for his calendar reforms, mocked rotation in one of his lost plays, preserved only in Aristophanes' parody. Why should the land need rest? It is not a soldier. If barley fails, whip it better. Still, even ridicule couldn't hide the results. Merchants began to note that Boeotian oil and grain were more consistent and less likely to spoil during shipment. Temples began trading surplus lentils, once considered peasant food, to feed acolytes and pilgrims. And slowly, the once backwater shrine of Demeter Pro Erosia became known not just for its strange soil, but its strange success. Early education. It's easy to forget that most ancient Greek education was practical. Outside the academies, boys learned by watching fathers, girls by shadowing mothers, and farmers by standing in fields. But the field itself became a kind of teacher. By the early 5th century BCE, farming families in central Greece had begun to introduce paids georgikoi, field apprentices. Young boys, and sometimes girls, were assigned small test plots, often just 5 or 6 paces wide, to plant whatever they chose. These mini-fields served as training, but also as micro-experiments. One father's note, preserved on wax tablet: "Let Thetelos choose his own seeds. If the soil favors him, the goddess approves. If not, he learns." It was education by trial, risk-free experimentation, a quiet pedagogy from the earth itself. Some of the best ideas in rotation combining grazing cycles with planting, alternating between fast-growing and slow-growing crops came not from scribes, but from these child plots. Changing stories, changing minds. Myths adapt, even if gods do not. By 460 BCE, a new variant of the Demeter-Persephone myth emerged in Boeotian storytelling circles. In it, after Persephone's return from the underworld, Demeter weeps not just for the underworld months, but for the tired soil. To restore it, she plants lentils before sowing barley. It's a minor adjustment, a shift in metaphor, but it reveals a people trying to reconcile practicality with belief. And in doing so, they gave crop rotation a sacred root. The story was picked up in rural dramas, echoed in festival songs, and carved into the walls of a rebuilt granary near Orchomenos. Demeter taught the earth to breathe again. No scientific paper could compete with that. A pattern solidifies. By 450 BCE, a rough 3-year rotation had become standard across several regions of Greece. Year 1, grain, wheat, or barley. Year 2, legume, lentils, beans, chickpeas. Year 3, fallow grazed by animals, then plowed. Not everyone followed it. The wealthy often clung to monoculture. Some regions lacked legumes. Others used olive groves as natural rest zones. But the concept had taken root. Temple records show fewer mentions of dead fields. Grain prices stabilized. Lentils, once seen as poor food, gained culinary prestige. Even the Eleusinian mysteries, Athens' most sacred rite, made subtle adjustments. The Kurnos offering dish was now said to hold all fruits of rotation, not just barley. It was not revolution, it was evolution. And in the dirt beneath their sandals, 1,000 uncelebrated farmers reshaped agriculture. When something works, we assume it will be remembered. But history has a way of losing what seems obvious, especially when the knowledge is born in quiet corners, written on crumbling clay, and practiced by hands too callous to write poems. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the 3-year crop rotation system had taken root across central Greece. It wasn't law. It wasn't even called by name. But it was there, embodied in practice, woven into story offered to the goddess. And yet, within a century, much of it would be forgotten. This is the story of how one of ancient Greece's most useful agricultural insights, discovered by trial, refined by necessity, and blessed in ritual, began to fade. Not because it was wrong, but because it was rural. The rise of empire, the shrinking of fields. As Athens entered its imperial period, its focus turned outward. Naval expeditions, tribute collection, and colonization pulled energy and attention from domestic agriculture. The countryside, once a place of experimentation and close relationship with the soil, became increasingly marginalized in political life. City elites bought up land, consolidated small plots, and relied on enslaved labor to maintain larger estates. These larger estates often favored monoculture, not because it was efficient, but because it was legible. Easier to manage, easier to sell, easier to tax. In temple ledgers from the 420s BCE onward, there's a visible shift. Crop entries become less diverse, land descriptions more uniform. Where earlier records mention legumes, fallow years, and animal grazing, the newer ones simply list grain area, expected yield. It was the language of surplus, not sustainability. The death of the local shrine. The small Boeotian shrine of Demeter Pro-Erosia, where all of this began, quietly fell into disuse after 405 BCE. There was no destruction, no dramatic suppression, just neglect. Pilgrims stopped visiting. The last recorded priest's name is Aristonax, dated roughly to 399 BCE. After that, the site disappears from religious calendars. Archaeological evidence suggests the altar was dismantled and repurposed into a field wall. The sanctuary's sacred well was capped with flat stones, probably to keep livestock from falling in. The rotation rituals, once folded into seasonal celebrations, faded without a central place to renew them. In the cities, Demeter was still honored, especially in her grand Eleusinian form, but she was honored for continuity, not for change. The cult grew increasingly abstract, more mystical, less agricultural. And the goddess of the field became a goddess of metaphor, the professionalization of knowledge. As Greek society evolved, knowledge became more formalized. Philosophy and natural science emerged as respected disciplines. Thinkers like Aristotle and Theophrastus recorded plant observations, and while they sometimes touched on crop sequence, it was rarely practical advice. In Theophrastus's Inquiry into Plants, he writes, "The earth yields to variety, but resents repetition. It's poetic, accurate, but it's not a manual." Without systematized writing by the people who actually worked the land, the mechanics of rotation remained folk knowledge shared among peasants, rarely taught in schools, and certainly not debated in the Lyceum. Agricultural treatises were more likely to focus on estate management, pest control, or how to preserve olive oil. Rotation, being unglamorous and difficult to regulate, fell to the background. War, displacement, and cultural disruption. The Peloponnesian War, followed by waves of conflict and Macedonian conquest, did more than destroy cities. It shattered continuity. Fields were left fallow not by design but by force. Farmers fled. Villages emptied. Oral traditions fractured. The child plots and family-led experiments that had once passed rotation knowledge forward became impractical luxuries. In some regions, forced planting resumed once the land was reoccupied, but often without memory of the old methods. And new settlers, including mercenaries or colonists, brought different practices. Monoculture returned. It was easier to measure, trade, and control. Even temples, once allied with field wisdom, shifted their focus. Where Demeter had once accepted lentils, she now received polished grain, purchased from markets rather than grown with care. Myth without memory. Curiously, the mythic adaptation of Demeter persisted. In stories told in rural Megara and parts of Thessaly, Demeter was still said to teach the three gifts: barley, beans, and rest. But the details thinned. The bean became a symbol, not a crop. Rest became spiritualized, a metaphor for winter, not fallow land. 1/3 century BCE hymn refers to her as she who teaches patience to the earth. A beautiful phrase but abstract. The living system, the deliberate sequence of cultivation, had become allegory. Roman echoes in a partial revival. Strangely, it was not until centuries later, under Roman rule, that echoes of Greek rotation re-emerged, filtered through practicality. Roman writers like Varro and Columella mention legume planting between wheat cycles. They advise allowing fields to recover and rotating crops to avoid soil exhaustion. Did they know of the Greek system? Perhaps indirectly. Rome had absorbed vast swathes of Greek knowledge, sometimes without attribution. But the Roman system was more organized. It treated land like infrastructure. Rotation was encouraged not by religion or folk wisdom, but by yield tables and estate profitability. Still, the bones of the idea were the same. In fact, Columella writes, "Let the land be varied in its appetite. Feed it now with vigor, then with rest, then with gentleness. As with the body, so with the field." Whether he knew it or not, he was echoing Menalc's rediscovered and reburied. Crop rotation was rediscovered multiple times throughout history in medieval monasteries, in 16th century England, and again during the agricultural revolution of the 18th century. Each time it was praised as brilliant. Each time its earlier incarnations from Boeotia, from the shrine of Pro-Erosia, from those parched bean fields were forgotten. There are no statues of Menalx, no festivals for the field that failed. But the principles remain. In many parts of the world today, subsistence farmers still rotate without charts, relying on memory, local knowledge, and trial much like the Greeks did. They are part of a lineage that goes unmarked in textbooks, but they are its truest heirs. Closing reflection. So how did Demeter invent crop rotation? She didn't, not directly, but the people who worshipped her, who struggled to feed their families, who knelt in the dirt and took risks they did. They saw the patterns. They changed what they planted. They adjusted rituals. They wove observation into worship. And in doing so, they turned a myth into method, one that shaped the survival of thousands, even if it never earned them a name in history. Story 3. The rain that lasted 19 years, Poseidon's forgotten bargain. You've heard of Poseidon as the god of the sea, master of earthquakes, tamer of horses. But the Poseidon of this story was neither roaring in the surf nor shaking mountains. He was dripping, and he was reportedly bored. This tale, mostly forgotten, barely recorded, centers around a small, flood-prone region of southern Thessaly. It involves a village drowned by accident, a promise broken by silence, and a slow rain that lasted 19 years. Not a storm, not a deluge. A rain. Constant, steady, and annoying. As with all ancient stories, especially the ones no one bothered to glorify, the lines between myth and administration blur. And somewhere in that blur was a contract not of parchment, but of belief between a mountain, a marsh, and a forgotten local god. The village of Cranon and the god of excess. Before Thessaly became a land of horse breeders and battlefields, it was home to swampy lowlands and unpredictable weather. The village of Cranon sat between two rivers that were usually dry except when they were. The people there lived by seasonal flow, plant fast, harvest early, move quickly when the rains arrived. Their relationship with the environment was not reverent, it was reactive. To manage the seasonal chaos, they built stone trenches and clay-lined canals, and they made offerings to the usual deities: Zeus for air, Demeter for grain, and Poseidon for water. But in Cranon, Poseidon wasn't the god of oceans. He was the god of leaks. In local votive inscriptions, Poseidon's name is followed not by Pelagios of the sea, but by the epithet Catarax, meaning the one who trickles. Offerings to Poseidon cataracts weren't cast into the sea. They were buried in shallow, soggy pits lined with reeds, often alongside broken buckets or worn-out sandals. A subtle message, enough already. The first bargain. Around 575 BCE, a curious inscription was etched into a boundary stone near Cranon. We offer 2 goats, 3 loaves, and silence. In return, let the god delay his waters until the harvest sleeps. This wasn't standard votive language. It read less like worship and more like negotiation, a local pact. The farmers were tired of surprise floods. They weren't asking Poseidon to stop the rain, just delay it. A kind of divine scheduling. The ritual that followed was equally odd. Instead of a single festival, they instituted the hush days, a stretch of 15 days during early autumn when no one spoke aloud about water, rain, or clouds. To mention the weather was to invite it. So they whispered about everything else. The fields dried, the crops came in, the system seemed to work. But no one really believed Poseidon was holding back the rain until the day he didn't. The rain begins. It started 1 year after the hush days were accidentally skipped. According to the local story, a newly appointed village priest unfamiliar with the tradition mistook the hush festival for a general fast and instead led a loud communal meal with songs and wine. Nothing happened at first, but later that week, the rain started. Not a storm, not punishment, just rain, steady, constant, soft enough that no single day felt disastrous, but it never stopped. Day after day, it misted across the fields, slicked the stone thresholds, wore grooves in the clay paths. Roofs began to sag. Walls began to darken. The village of Crannon wasn't submerged overnight. It slowly dissolved. Grain rotted on the stalk. Amphrey grew slippery with moss. Moss grew on children. By year 3, families started moving to higher ground. By year 6, the priest had resigned. By year 9, the canal stones had turned green. And still the rain came. The response from the polis. You might expect this to draw attention, but Crannon was Athens or Corinth or Thebes. It was a village on no trade route, contributing no hoplites to any war, and known for nothing but sheep with soggy wool. Still, word eventually reached Larissa, the nearest urban center, where a regional magistrate dispatched a clerk to investigate. The clerk's name, according to temple logs, was Menesios. He was young, skeptical, and allergic to goats. His written account, preserved in a brittle fragment, copied by a later Roman archivist, reads, Crannon is not flooded, it is damp, unreasonably, unyieldingly damp. Their crops mildew in place. The streets squish underfoot. The people seem accustomed. Menesios stayed for 2 weeks. He left with a sore throat, a half-mossed sandal, and a reluctant respect for the locals' calm. His only suggestion to Larissa was, advise them to consider duck farming. The city ignored the report. Crannon was left to fend for itself. The Shrine of Wet Stones. Around year 12 of the reign, the villagers, what few remained, rebuilt their Poseidon shrine. The original pit offering site had collapsed. In its place, they constructed a low stone circle filled with gravel and crushed oyster shells, even though oysters were 100 miles away. Symbolism mattered more than sourcing. The shrine bore no statue, only a stone slab inscribed with, "You were heard, we heard too, please forget us." It wasn't clear whether this was a prayer, a curse, or an apology. Offerings resumed, but now they were reversed. Instead of asking Poseidon to wait, they asked him to remember the silence. One priest, an older man named Thallos, took to sitting inside the shrine each morning with a dry cloth in his lap. He never used it. He just held it, as if ready to dry something should the moment come. He did this for 5 years. The rain continued. So what finally changed in year 19? Why did the rain stop, and what did the villagers do when it did? 19 years is long enough for a village to forget what dry ground feels like. Children were born who had never seen dust. Roofs were built with steeper pitches. Bread was baked thinner to avoid softening in the air. Old men stopped telling stories about summer heat. It sounded like fiction. In the marsh-gray morning of the 6,950th day of rain, something changed. Not with a crack of thunder, not with a gust of wind, just stillness. It was the first dry dawn in Crannon in nearly 2 decades. Thallos in the dry cloth. Thallos, the elderly priest who had waited daily in the shrine with a dry cloth on his lap, noticed it before anyone else. The cloth was no longer a symbol, it had become a habit, folded precisely, never used. But that morning, as he sat on the low stone ring of the shrine, he felt something rare, warmth. The wind wasn't carrying moisture. The usual drip from the shrine's overhang was absent. For a long moment, he stared at the air as if it might betray him, but it didn't. He touched the stone beneath him, dry. Thallos stood stiffly, slowly, and for the first time in 19 years, unfolded the cloth and wiped his brow. Not because it was wet, but because the gesture had waited too long. He walked into the village and rang the cracked bronze bell that once signaled market day. It hadn't rung in years. The sound startled the sheep. A community in suspended habit. The villagers didn't cheer. They didn't dance, they looked up. A few cautiously touched their door lintels. Others waited for the inevitable drizzle to return. It didn't. By noon, the moss on the southern wall of the granary had begun to brown. Clay paths, once slick, began to show cracks. Dust faint, grayish, but real rose when people walked. And still no rain. It wasn't until the fourth day of dryness that someone dared speak the words. "It has stopped." Even then, some villagers responded by whispering, as if afraid to wake the god. The curious return of Menesios. Word of the change eventually reached Larissa, where the same scribe Menesios, now balding and grumpier, insisted on returning. He arrived on the 22nd day of dryness, with sandals made of tarred leather and a pouch of lemon oil to disinfect the damp. What he found surprised him. Cranon had not just survived, it had adapted. The villagers had invented ways to live in wetness: sloped beds, water-resistant grain sacks, low-growing leafy greens that thrived in moisture. Their clothes were waxed with fish oil. Tools were suspended in rafters and lowered with ropes. And yet, they didn't know what to do with the dry. Fields long abandoned or given to moss now baked gently in the sun. The earth was hard, cracked, unfamiliar. Menesios wrote in his second report, "They await instruction, but from no one in particular. I suspect they are hesitant to hope." A ritual reversed. Thalos, sensing the village's paralysis, organized a new ritual. He called it the offering of absence. No food, no flowers, just the act of doing nothing. On the 30th day of dryness, the villagers gathered around the shrine and sat. No songs, no prayers, just waiting. After an hour, Thalos stood and said, "The god has heard our silence before. Let him hear it now, not as plea, but thanks." He then scattered a handful of dry soil into the shrine's basin, the first time dry earth had been seen in it since the rain began. This was not celebration, it was recognition. And for Cranon, it was enough. Replanting a future. But practical matters waited. What to plant? The seed stores were outdated, the tools rusted, the irrigation channels, long used for drainage, now needed redirection. A young woman named Dione, one of the children born during the rain, proposed an experiment. She divided a small dry plot into quarters and planted 4 different things: barley, beans, wildflower, and fallow. "We don't know what the earth wants anymore," she said. "We'll let it show us." Her quiet experiment became a village effort. Every family took a similar small patch. Some used compost made from moss, others ash from dried reeds. A few introduced sheep grazing, unsure if it would harm or help. What resulted was not immediate abundance, but tentative yield. Barley sprouted weakly, but enough to eat. Beans returned. The wildflower patches bloomed with shocking color. No one knew what to do with them, so they left them. Dione's plan resembled crop rotation, not because she had read about it, but because variety felt safer than certainty. The land, like the people, needed to relearn. The temple that never came. What's perhaps most telling is what didn't happen. No new temple was built to Poseidon cataracts, no marble statue, no priesthood expansion. The shrine remained the same, a moss-lined stone circle now dry with a single cracked slab that still read, "You were heard, we heard too, please forget us." But over time, the villagers began to walk barefoot past it in the morning, not in fear, but in rhythm. Children learned to trace the outline of the shrine with their fingers, not as a warning but as a habit, a tactile memory. Poseidon was no longer a threat, nor a savior. He was something else entirely, a pattern. But the question remains, did Poseidon actually stop the rain, or did the people simply learn to endure it until it passed? And what, exactly, was the price of forgetting a bargain once made? As the village of Cranon slowly adjusted to its new dryness, a quiet anxiety settled in. Not the panic of drowning crops or flooded homes, but a subtler discomfort. The awareness that something profound had passed, and no one knew quite how to talk about it. Poseidon's reign had shaped the landscape, the people, and their habits for nearly 2 decades. Now that it was gone, what remained was a void, a silence with memory. And underneath it all lingered the question: had the god kept his part of the bargain, or had the villagers simply endured long enough to forget they ever made one? The next generation, children who had been born in the middle years of the reign, were now young adults. They had never learned to look for shadows at midday or how to tell weather by the smell of wind. Their first experience of true heat came slowly and with caution. When the summer sun began to harden the ground in Crannon's lower pastures, these young farmers hesitated. Their elders, used to wetness, misjudged planting times. A few tried to rebuild the old reed canals to channel any rain that might come again. Others simply waited, unsure if this dryness was permanent or just a cruel interlude. Dione, whose experiment in planting had given the village its first post-rain harvest, became an informal guide. She kept logs of crop success, rainfall, and pest behavior, carving simple symbols into clay tiles that hung from her courtyard wall. A barley stalk for success, a cracked earth glyph for drought, a curled bean pod for spoilage, and a wave for uncertainty. She never used the wave tile. The village had agreed, no talk of rain, not as hope, not as fear. Poseidon's name was still known, but no longer spoken aloud in ritual. They had made a bargain, and he had answered it too well. The shrinking shrine. By the 4th year of dryness, the old shrine of Poseidon cataracts had begun to crumble. Without the moisture that once kept moss clinging to its sides, the shrine's stones began to split under the sun. The gravel basin dried and cracked. Thalos, now too old to walk unaided, visited only once a month. One day, he left behind the dry cloth he had once carried, daily folded, yellowed, left on the stone where the priest once sat. He died later that winter, peacefully, during a frost rare enough that people remarked on it for months. The shrine was not rebuilt. Instead, a single stone from its basin was taken and placed upright in the village's central square. Nothing was carved into it. No name, no plea. It stood not as an altar, but as a placeholder, a reminder. Crannon no longer worshipped Poseidon cataracts, but they didn't pretend he'd never existed. Memory into myth. The rain, so constant, so inescapable, began to recede in memory as something unreal. Children born after it ended could not grasp the texture of it, how ceilings had dripped in rhythm, how grain had to be stored in oilcloth bundles, how bread had to be eaten quickly before it absorbed the air. Older villagers tried to tell them. They described the daily gray, the green sheen on their sandals, the rust-colored light of sunrise through mist. But over time, these became just stories. Poseidon became a character, not a god. In some retellings, he was described as a giant who wept slowly. In others, he was a leaky barrel that the sky had forgotten to patch. And in one peculiar children's rhyme preserved in a tablet from a later traveler: "Don't step twice in the puddle wide, or Poseidon will fill your stride. Don't speak of clouds or speak of rain. The leaky god might start again." What had once been ritual became metaphor. What had once been dread became nursery verse. The scholar who didn't believe. 2 centuries later, a visiting scholar from Thebes named Nyctes came to Crannon seeking inscriptions about regional religious customs. He found the mossless stone in the square and asked locals about it. One farmer, old enough to remember the last wet season, told him, "That's where the god lived, the one we asked to stop." Nyctes recorded this in his travelogue, Marginal Gods of the Interior, but he dismissed it as folklore. There is no record in major temples of any Poseidon under the name cataracts. I suspect a local rain spirit elevated into regional myth due to prolonged weather. And yet, when Nyctes returned to Thebes and published his notes, he included a passing comment. What's curious is not that they believed a bargain had been made, but that they still feared breaking it, generations later. This was the final academic mention of Poseidon cataracts for nearly 1,600 years. The bargain faded into dust not erased, but eroded. Echoes in the dirt. Modern archaeologists have found the layered soils of ancient Cranon unusually complex. A thin, consistent stratum of saturated clay corresponds roughly with the estimated time of the rain years. Beneath that, normal silt. Above it, standard loam. In that clay layer, they found remains of unusual offerings. Water-worn sandals, reeds tied with bronze wire, crushed barley in sealed pots, items that don't appear in other Thessalian sites. It was not a site of war, not a site of commerce, but a site of sustained discomfort, adaptation, negotiation with the elements. The rain had not been a myth. Only the bargain was. Final reflection. When we think of ancient gods, we think of drama. Thunderbolts, monsters, battles. But this story, quiet, damp, enduring, shows us another side of belief. A bargain was made, it was broken, then perhaps fulfilled, or perhaps the people simply outlasted the gods' patience. Either way, it shaped lives. Not through glory, but through inconvenience, through soggy bread, through waiting, through boredom. Poseidon cataracts is not remembered in grand temples. He has no surviving cult, but for nearly 2 decades, he ruled a village not with waves or quakes, but with a drizzle. And for those who lived through it, he was real enough. Story 4. When Apollo got jury duty. Apollo, the radiant god of music, prophecy, and plague, was not known for patience. He loved movement, strings strummed in rhythm, arrows loosed in precision, and sunbeams racing across the sky. Stillness didn't suit him. Which is what makes this story so strange. One time, and just once, as far as we know, Apollo was ordered by divine decree to sit in judgment. Not as a deity watching from afar, not as an oracular voice echoing through Pythian temples, but as a literal member of a civic jury. 12 seats, 11 mortals, 1 god. It sounds absurd even to the Greeks, but there it is, tucked away in a dusty Athenian court record and 2 half-forgotten hymns. It's a quiet tale of bureaucracy, divine discomfort, and how the Athenian judicial system once tried to be fair, a little too literally. It begins in the year 462 BCE, with a goat theft, a jurisdictional dilemma, and an oracle who wished she'd said less. The crime. The victim was a farmer named Nesigoras. The crime, the theft of 5 goats from his hillside pasture on a chilly winter night. The accused, a Thessalian migrant named Euxithios, recently arrived in Attica with questionable documents and a nervous donkey. A local trial was held. Witnesses gave contradictory statements. Someone saw hoofprints, someone heard bleeding, someone else swore by Hermes that Euxithios couldn't tell a goat from a goose. Still, the case might have been resolved quietly, except for one complication. Euxithios claimed divine exemption. He had, he said, been declared protected in deed and spirit by the oracle at Delphi. He carried with him a small wax tablet bearing the seal of the Pythia, priestess of Apollo. That changed everything. Divine exemption and mortal law. The concept of divine exemption wasn't new. Sanctuary seekers often clung to temple steps to avoid trial. Some bore tokens from oracles or temples promising safety, especially if they were victims of war, slavery, or ritual exile. But rarely did those exemptions hold up in court, especially in theft cases. Athens prided itself on its rational legal system. The Areopagus, the ancient court, handled serious crimes, while lesser offenses went before citizen juries. But how do you try a man under the protection of a god? And more importantly, how do you subpoena the god? The oracle's mistake. Delphi in those days was still recovering from a recent fire. The oracle statements were being transcribed more carefully, and the Pythia at the time, a woman named Phanostrate, was known for her enthusiasm. When asked whether Euxithios had the favor of Apollo, she had reportedly said, "The god walks beside him, his breath on the neck of judgment." It was probably meant poetically, but Euxithios had the response inscribed and carried it with him. In Athens, that phrasing caused a bureaucratic panic. The archon overseeing the case, a cautious man named Aeschylian, wrote to Delphi asking for clarification. Weeks passed. The reply came curtly. "The god stands witness, that is enough." Enough for what? Athens didn't know, so Aeschylian made a decision: let the god serve as witness, literally. Preparing the jury box. There was precedent for invoking gods in court oaths, appeals, even symbolic statues placed in temples for judgment. But never had a god been expected to sit. Still, Apollo was a citizen of the city in a way. His cult had a sanctuary. His festivals were paid for by public funds. So they made space. The court selected 12 jurors. One seat was left empty, polished, robed in white linen with a small sun disk painted on the bench. No one sat in it, but no one touched it either. This was Apollo's seat. A court herald announced his presence with a traditional hymn sung softly. No one laughed, not even the skeptics. The trial began. The trial of Euxithios. Nesigoras the farmer presented his case: 5 goats missing, hoofprints leading to a shed, a suspicious Thessalian in possession of a new goat skin, suspiciously the same size as his largest doe. Euxithios countered he had bought the skin in Thebes. The goats ran off during a storm. The tracks were misleading. Also, he was under divine witness. The jury listened, so did Apollo. There is, in one fragment of a court transcription, a description of the divine seat. The sunlight fell longest on the empty chair. None dared cast shadow across it. When the wind shifted, the curtain behind it moved as if breath passed through. It may have been poetic or nervous imagination, but the trial proceeded in full seriousness. How Apollo voted. In Athenian juries, each juror dropped a pebble, white for innocent, black for guilty, into a sealed jar. The pebbles were then counted by officials. This time, 11 jurors voted. Then the priest of Apollo, a thin man named Calliope, stepped forward. He bowed to the empty seat, held a single white pebble over the jar, and said, "For the God who sees without doubt." He dropped it in. The count: 6 guilty, 6 not guilty. Tie. And in Athens, a tie meant acquittal. Euxithios was cleared of all charges. Aftermath and awkward questions. The verdict caused mild unrest. Some Athenians claimed the entire event was blasphemous, a god performing civic duty. Others insisted it was the height of Athenian fairness. Even a god could be part of the process. One philosopher, Antiphanes of the Kerameikos, wrote, "If a god may serve in jury, he may serve in tax. Let Apollo pay for the next festival." He was fined for impiety. Meanwhile, Euxithios left Athens quietly. No one heard of him again. The priest Calliope resigned the following year, saying only, "Gods do not sit, that is for men." The chair was removed from the court. Apollo was never again summoned. But the question lingered for decades. What does it mean when a god agrees to obey mortal laws, or worse, when we imagine they might? After the trial of the empty chair, as it came to be quietly known, the incident slowly faded from public debate. There were no riots, no divine thunderbolts, just an acquitted goat thief, a priest's resignation, and a white pebble that may or may not have been Apollo's. But among Athens, scribes, priests, and philosophers, the matter lingered like an afterthought, the kind that returns during long walks home or over watered wine. What exactly had happened? Was it a divine intervention, a poetic farce, or a momentary glimpse into how religion and bureaucracy sometimes collided, not with drama, but with slow, confusing paperwork? This section explores how one god's symbolic service led to a ripple of philosophical unease and quiet legal adaptation, not in dramatic edicts, but in the margins of scrolls, the footnotes of speeches, and the awkward silences between oaths. Repercussions in the legal world. The Athenians were proud of their legal system. They believed in citizen juries, deliberation, and the principle that even the powerful must answer to law. But the Apollo case had unsettled some assumptions. A decree circulated briefly in the year 461 BCE stating, "Let no non-mortal be named in citizen selection by lot." A bureaucratic way of saying, no gods on jury duty. It was mostly symbolic. Gods had never been on the selection rolls. But after the Apollo trial, someone had raised the possibility. What if a particularly devout clerk included divine names in the lottery jar? What if temples started lobbying for gods to be represented in public affairs? The decree was preemptive, absurd, and entirely Athenian. No records show any gods being selected before or after, but the law was passed anyway. Philosophers and the problem of the divine vote. In the wake of the trial, the city's philosophical circles grew curious. At the Lyceum, young students debated whether Apollo's vote, cast by his priest, was truly divine or just symbolic. If it was symbolic, had the trial really tied? If it was divine, had mortals erred by including gods in decisions meant for men? Socrates, then in his early 20s, is rumored, though not confirmed, to have remarked, "If a god speaks through silence, perhaps we are not listening hard enough." In later writings by his student Xenophon, there's a passing reference to the sunlit chair of Apollo as a metaphor for quiet authority, the kind that influences decisions without argument. Plato never commented directly on the incident, but in Laws, he proposes that religious authority should advise laws, not decide them, perhaps a quiet echo of the awkward outcome in Euxithio's trial. The role of the oracle reconsidered. The Pythia at Delphi Phanestrate never publicly addressed the case again, but Delphi's next high priest implemented a policy that all oracular statements involving legal matters be issued with clarifying addendums. For example, the god walks beside him in moral spirit, not in legal standing. It was the beginning of what modern scholars jokingly call divine disclaimers. The oracles, once comfortably vague, now hedged their phrasing in cases where their words might become civic complications. Theologians at the time argued that prophecy was never meant to serve as evidence, but the Apollo case had shown that mortals would use whatever divine favor they could, especially in court. In response, more oracles began delivering answers in metaphor rather than declarative statements. Vagueness, once criticized, became a kind of protection for gods and people alike. The pebble and the chair. The white pebble used in the trial was kept for a while in the civic archives. A small inscription was added years later, "Apollo's judgment," or "someone else." It was eventually lost during a fire in the late 4th century BCE. The chair, the actual seat left empty for Apollo during the trial, was more memorable. For decades afterward, young jurors would sometimes joke about taking the god's seat if they arrived late. It became a minor superstitious taboo. No one wanted to sit in the 12th seat during a tie vote. In 436 BCE, a local sculptor named Chionides crafted a clay figurine titled "The God Who Listened," a robed figure seated, facing slightly away, with no facial features. It was displayed briefly at the festival of the Lesser Dionysia, then quietly stored. Art historians believe it was inspired by Apollo's presence at the trial, though others think it was simply an abstract meditation on civic indifference. Still, the association remained. The idea of a god being present but not intervening, watching but saying nothing, voting but without explanation. It unsettled people more than it comforted them. Euxithios and his vanishing act. As for Euxithios, the man at the center of it, all no further record survives. Some say he left Athens and became a minor temple custodian in Boeotia. Others claim he took to wandering, selling small oracular charms and carved pebbles inscribed with Apollo's name. One traveler's note from 455 BCE describes a pale man in a ragged cloak offering blessings in exchange for figs. He spoke of sun gods and fair judgment. His teeth were few, his voice was kind. Whether it was Euxithios or not, we can't know. But his case had set a strange precedent, that divine favor could be present in civic justice, but only once and only awkwardly. But what if Apollo had actually spoken? What if his silence wasn't permission but protest? How would the courts and the city have responded then? By all accounts, Apollo never spoke during the trial. He didn't whisper judgment from behind the clouds. He didn't appear in a dream. The wind didn't stir when the vote was cast. The birds didn't shift their song. There was only the sun, steady and indifferent, casting its golden light on the empty 12th chair. But as generations passed, that silence took on a life of its own. In the absence of thunder or proclamation, Athenians began to wonder, what does it mean when a god is present and chooses not to act? The silence interpreted. Some said Apollo's stillness was a form of consent, that he saw no guilt in Euxithios and had quietly tipped the scales with a white pebble. Others believed it was condemnation, that he refused to interfere in mortal law even when called, that his vote was a kind of divine sarcasm. You want a god in your courts? Fine. Here I sit and I say nothing. Still others proposed that the whole trial had offended him, that summoning a god for goat theft was petty and presumptuous. A common argument among the older priesthood was, Apollo is a god of harmony. Do not drag him into discord. But for every theory there was a rebuttal, and in the absence of clarity the story became something else, a parable, a myth, a thought experiment. One teacher in the Agora was known to quiz students with the riddle. You are the god, the case is before you, do you vote? The most common answer, only if it matters. Civic lessons from a divine misstep. Despite its absurdity, the Apollo jury trial left its mark on Athenian civic thought, not in new laws or rituals, but in subtler ways. For example, some juries began reserving a symbolic empty seat when deliberating on cases involving exile or religious offense, not because they expected divine judgment, but to remind themselves that, sometimes, silence meant responsibility. A marble inscription in the Areopagus dating to 450 BCE reads, "The gods do not answer when asked to judge. Let men be wise before calling them." The line became something of a proverb engraved above smaller courts and inscribed at the entrances of village assemblies. It wasn't about Apollo, strictly speaking. It was about restraint. Don't invoke what you can't understand. Don't ask gods to solve what humans can. Religion reframed in court. In the decades following the trial, Athens subtly revised how religious protections were used in legal arguments. Previously, divine tokens or oracular endorsements could sway juries, especially in emotionally charged cases. But after Euxithios, such tokens were scrutinized more closely. Juries were instructed to consider them spiritual context, not legal defense. More importantly, the role of priests in trials was reduced. Apollo's priest, Calamenes, who had cast the god's vote, had stepped beyond traditional boundaries. His resignation sparked debate in the Boule, the city council, about the separation of temple authority from civic process. As a result, future priests attending trials did so only as silent observers, unless directly summoned as character witnesses. This was perhaps the trial's most lasting effect, a quiet boundary drawn between belief and bureaucracy. The cultural afterlife of the trial. Within 2 generations, the story of Apollo's jury duty had transformed. Playwrights referenced it in satire. One lost comedy by Euphrides apparently featured a character who calls upon the entire Olympian pantheon to vote on whether his cloak should be returned. Poets used it as metaphor. In one ode to the seasons, the line reads, "Let the god vote last, lest the spring arrive undecided." And in the Academy, philosophers used it to test arguments about justice and the divine. Was Apollo's silence a form of justice? Was asking a god to vote a form of hubris? Was neutrality ever divine? Each question led to more, but answers none definitive. A final tablet. In 387 BCE, nearly 75 years after the original trial, a clay tablet was found during repairs at the edge of the Agora. It bore a simple drawing, a 12-seat bench with one seat shaded in gold pigment. Beneath it, a line of text. The sun sat here, the shadow made the choice. It was unsigned, likely a student's exercise in philosophy or a craftsman's idle reflection, but it captured something essential. That in trying to make the divine serve mortal needs, the Athenians had glimpsed the limits of law and the boundaries of worship. And in the end, the gods said nothing. The trial's place in boring history. No wars were won because of this story, no borders changed, no reforms swept the city. But in that single quiet courtroom, on that bright Athenian day in 462 BCE, 11 citizens and one empty chair carried out a ritual of belief, reason, and procedural confusion. They asked a god to judge a man. And then they listened to nothing. That silence echoed longer than any speech could have. Final reflection. This was not a tale of glory or tragedy or great reform. It was a story of systems, of a trial, a chair, a vote, and the quiet awkwardness of trying to fold divinity into civic life. And in that awkwardness, we find a strange kind of honesty, that even the gods, when seated among us, might not know what to say. Story 5. Hestia and the bureaucracy of hearth maintenance. She didn't ride chariots. She didn't hurl thunder. She didn't seduce mortals or throw festivals. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, was different. She was quiet, constant, the first to receive every offering and the last to leave any gathering. To the ancient Greeks, she represented domestic stability, the still point around which every home, temple, and city turned. But even the goddess of fire needed caretakers. This is the story not of Hestia herself, but of those who tended her sacred flame in the cities of classical Greece. Their job sounds simple: keep the fire burning, but behind that simplicity was one of the most elaborate, underappreciated bureaucracies in the ancient world. This is the history of hearth maintenance, the boring, essential work of religious civil servants, and what happened when, one year, the fire almost went out. The flame that never slept. In the center of every Greek prytaneon, the civic hall of the city, there was a hearth. At its heart, a flame. This was not a metaphor. It was a real fire kept burning day and night, fed with carefully measured wood, guarded by a rotating team of civic attendants, inspected monthly, reported on quarterly. Because if the flame went out, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a crisis. The hearth fire symbolized the unity and life of the polis. Every colony founded by Greek settlers carried with them embers from the mother city's flame. Marriages, treaties, even markets began with offerings to Hestia. And so, in cities like Athens, Argos, and Delphi, entire departments, the Hestiarchy, were created to oversee the hearth. Their job was dull. Their job was sacred. The Hestiarcha, civil servants of sacred flame. You might imagine priests in flowing robes. You'd be wrong. The Hestiarchi were mid-tier bureaucrats, often former tradesmen or minor politicians who had aged out of more exciting posts. They wore simple woolen tunics, often stained with ash. They kept logs. They scheduled wood deliveries. They trained apprentices in how to bank coals to preserve heat overnight. In Athens, the team was composed of chief Hestiarchos, oversaw operations, maintained logs. Wood steward Xylocometes, managed timber supplies. Coal tender, monitored embers and backup braziers. Fire scribe, recorded flame status and incidents. Night watch flamekeeper, stayed overnight in shifts to prevent flare-outs. Each had a seal. Each submitted monthly scrolls to the city archive. One preserved document from 448 BCE records. Night watch report, flame healthy. Coal reserve at 3 baskets. Unusual wind from northeast required second screen placement. It's not thrilling, but it was civilization. Fire incidents and the protocol of relighting. Sometimes, despite their care, the flame did go out. There were protocols for that. First, a flame failure report was filed with specific cause codes. Common codes included W3, wind-induced extinction. H1, human error, snoozing attendant. F7, fuel delivery failure. R2, rodent interference, yes, really. Once the report was logged, a new flame had to be relit from a pure source, usually from the altar of Hestia in Delphi or another major temple. A messenger would be dispatched with a sealed fire pot designed to preserve embers over long distances. The relay process could take days. During that time, all civic ceremonies were paused, markets operated quietly, marriages were delayed. It wasn't panic, it was a kind of civic mourning. A silent acknowledgement that something had lapsed and now had to be restored, slowly and properly. In 453 BCE, such a lapse occurred in Argos. A wood delivery was delayed by flooding, and the night watch fell asleep. The flame died. The Hestiarchos at the time, Damocles, wrote in his log. It was not loud, it was not dramatic. The light dimmed and we all held breath, knowing we would have to confess. Training and testing. Becoming a Hestiarchos was no small feat. Candidates underwent a year-long apprenticeship, during which they studied types of wood and their burn qualities: olive, pine, laurel. Weatherproofing techniques for outdoor altars. Ember banking strategies for winter. Smoke ventilation and chimney care. Flame symbolism in civic rituals. They were tested not with essays, but by simulation. One clay tablet, exam question from an apprentice test reads: a downdraft has smothered the flame during a spring festival. Smoke rises but no light is visible. Is the flame still alive? What steps do you take? Correct answer: remove upper ash, check for red glow. If present, gently fan. If absent, notify chief, initiate secondary coal source, prepare for relight request. These men weren't poets, they weren't warriors. They were maintenance specialists. And without them, the city couldn't function. Disputes over fire and fuel. As cities grew, so did arguments over whose job it was to deliver fuel. In Thebes, a 3-year feud broke out between the Wood Guild and the Temple of Hestia. The guild demanded higher pay for laurel deliveries, citing spiritual hazard. The temple countered that laurel was sacred and shouldn't be priced like pine. Eventually, the city council ruled that all religious use wood must be priced based on volume, not perceived holiness. A scribal note in the case reads: let not the godliness of wood inflate the cost of burning it. Boring, yes. Necessary, absolutely. Without wood there was no fire, and without fire there was no polis. But in 445 BCE, something happened in Athens that shook the office of the Hestiarcha to its core, a complete failure of the system. What went wrong, and how did the city respond? In the year 445 BCE, the city of Athens experienced something it had not seen in over a century: a full civic hearth failure. Not a smoldering ember, not a flicker blown out by wind. The flame Hestia's flame died. It happened quietly in the early hours before dawn. And as with most institutional breakdowns, it was not the fault of one person, but a series of small, overlooked issues: a missed delivery, a sick watchman, a faulty vent, a stretched protocol. It was a failure of paperwork, of planning, and of trust. But most of all, it was a test. How would a city built on ritual respond when the symbol of its unity disappeared? How it happened. The chain of events began 3 days earlier with a late timber shipment. The wood steward, a man named Crithon, noted in his weekly report that the northern pine stockpile had been depleted, and laurel wood was being rationed due to religious obligations at the Eleusinian festival. The coal tender, meanwhile, had been assigned double shifts due to an outbreak of fevers among the junior staff. The backup embers, usually kept in clay jars buried under sand for insulation, had not been refreshed in a week. Then came the wind. On the evening of Hecatombean 23rd, a dry northerly gust swept through the city, funneling through the open-air Prytanean. The flame danced wildly for hours, and by 3:00 a.m., the last flamekeeper on duty, a man named Timens, had nodded off. By 3:45 a.m., the coals had gone dark. No flicker, no smoke, just cold stone. The morning after, when the next shift arrived just after dawn, they found the brazier lifeless. There was no panic, no shouting. Just stunned silence. Protocol demanded the filing of an incident report within 1 hour. The fire scribe, a notoriously meticulous man named Epicles, recorded the event in red ink, a practice reserved for civic emergencies. Code H1: wind assisted, full flame loss. Estimated downtime 9 hours, embers unrecoverable, request for relight relay initiated. Crithon, the wood steward, submitted a separate log. Fuel insufficient due to miscommunication with Laurel Temple suppliers, requesting formal arbitration. By midday, messengers had been dispatched to Delphi to retrieve a new flame from Hestia's original altar. They traveled on horseback, carrying specially insulated bronze fireboxes lined with lamb's wool and sealed with wax. It would take 2 full days. The city pauses. In those 2 days, life in Athens slowed. By unwritten tradition, no civic rituals could proceed without the flame. Public speeches were shortened. No weddings were held. No sacrifices burned in the smaller temples. All flames had to come from the central hearth. Votive offerings were placed unlit. A theater performance was postponed. A marketplace priest refused to consecrate the weighing scales for the week's trade. 1 grain shipment from Euboea was delayed at port. The harbor watch claimed they couldn't bless the cargo without the city's warmth. Most people understood. A few grumbled. But underneath the procedural disruptions was something else: a strange, collective stillness, as if the city were waiting for its breath to return. The Hestiarch under scrutiny. While the city paused, the office of the Hestiarchy boiled with tension. The Archon Basilius, the official charged with religious matters, summoned Chief Hestiarchos Megacles for questioning. Their conversation, partially preserved in a later comic parody, was reportedly dry and defensive. Archon, how does a flame that is never meant to die go out? Megaklus, all things mortal are subject to error, even the divine when managed by men. Archon, that's not a defense, that's a proverb. A council was convened to evaluate whether new protocols were needed. Suggestions included building a second, protected hearth indoors, assigning a rotating military guard to flame duty, increasing fines for delayed timber deliveries, introducing written redundancies for fuel ordering. None of these were adopted immediately, but the fact that they were discussed at all marked a shift. For the first time, the city acknowledged that even sacred systems required modernization. The return of the flame. On the third morning, just before first light, the messengers returned from Delphi. The embers carried in sealed bronze, carefully banked with ash and beeswax, were still glowing. At the base of the Prytanean, the entire team of Hestiarcha assembled. Each carried a small bundle of prepared wood and a pinch of salt. They placed the fuel gently, fanned the embers, and waited. The first tongue of flame rose at dawn. A low cheer spread through the small crowd. A bell was rung. Nearby temples lit their torches from the central fire. Children were given olive oil cakes. No grand speeches, no proclamations. Just fire, warm, flickering, and alive. Institutional memory. In the months that followed, reforms were quietly introduced. The most notable was the creation of the twin flame system, a secondary hearth, lit from the original, kept in a separate chamber with a thick terracotta dome and triple ventilation screens. This backup fire was checked weekly and guarded constantly. Its existence was never publicly announced, but references to it appear in scribe notes from 443 BCE onward. The official story: the flame never went out again. Privately, it probably did, once or twice, but the twin flame ensured continuity. More importantly, the people and their administrators had accepted that sacred systems, like all others, needed planning, redundancy, and quiet adaptation. Even Hestia needed backup. But what does it say about the values of a city when so much weight is placed on a single, unseen fire? And how did the concept of civic flame evolve in colonies, where Hestia's reach stretched far from the mother hearth? The Athenian hearth may have burned in marble and ash beneath the Prytanean, but its light reached far beyond the city's borders. Every Greek colony from Syracuse in Sicily to Cyrene in North Africa began with the same ritual. A single flame taken from the mother city's hearth, carried in sealed vessels, carefully watched, never left unattended. The fire symbolized continuity, legitimacy, and identity. But once the flame arrived, who kept it burning? This final section explores the little-known world of colonial flamekeepers, their methods, improvisations, and the quiet failures that history mostly forgot. In the process, we see how Hestia's bureaucratic order became more fragile, more flexible, and sometimes completely reinvented. Embers on the sea. Colonists often sailed for weeks before reaching their new home. Fire, delicate and fussy even on land, was perilous at sea. To preserve it, they used what was called a phosphoros, a bronze container layered with heat-resistant ash, beeswax, and fine sheep's wool. Tended by a designated flamekeeper, often a woman, sometimes a priest, rarely a sailor, it was strapped to the ship's stern, far from cargo and weather. One captain's log from a Corinthian voyage to Ambracia notes: storm on fourth day, all sails reefed, oxen sick, flamekeeper vomited into the ember pot but fire survived, praise to Hestia. Another account from a Thasian expedition is more somber. On the 10th day, a rogue wave breached the aft deck, fire drowned, ceremony repeated with flint and prayer, no one spoke of it again. Not all flames made it, but the ritual did. Even if the original fire was lost, colonists often claimed it was. The appearance of continuity mattered more than literal truth. Colonial Prytanea, improvisation in the wilderness. When colonists arrived at their new site, the first permanent structure erected was not a wall or a well, but the hearth enclosure, usually a circle of stones around a bronze brazier, hastily roofed with timber. Unlike the stone-built civic hearths of the mother cities, these were provisional, exposed to the elements, vulnerable to storms, theft, or simply being forgotten in the rush of building shelters. So colonial cities developed mobile flame protocols. If a hearth structure couldn't be maintained, the fire was relocated daily, moved in a brazier from shelter to shelter, guarded by a rotating team. In Cyrene, surviving records describe a flamekeeping rota shared among 5 founding families. Each family hosted the flame in their home for 1 month, then ceremonially transferred it to the next. The ceremony involved wine, song, and the passing of a coal tongs wrapped in dyed linen, the tong of trust. One poem composed centuries later romanticized this act. Not land nor law first binds a city, but a woman with ash on her hands, carrying yesterday's warmth to tomorrow. It wasn't poetic in practice. It was awkward and smoky, but it kept Hestia alive, training flamekeepers far from home. In the colonies, there were no established Hestiarcha, so cities developed their own forms of fire bureaucracy. In Gela, Sicily, records show the position of Pyrepharos, literally fire bringer, elected annually, responsible for maintaining fire logs, wood types and amounts, training assistants in coal preservation, liaising with local temples for ceremonial use, submitting quarterly fire status reports to the Synedrian local council. The first known Pyrepharos, a man named Daphantos, wrote in his inaugural scroll, "Let the fire be silent but never absent. Let no ceremony begin without the ember's approval." These officials often served until death or infirmity. Their families were sometimes given tax exemptions in exchange for their flamekeeping service, a reminder that even bureaucracy, when attached to ritual, could become hereditary. When flames died and nobody knew. Unlike in Athens, where a lost flame paused civic life, colonial cities sometimes lied. When the hearth went out due to wind, rot, or negligence, some colonies quietly rekindled it without ceremony. Others sent messengers back to the mother city to retrieve a refreshed flame. Some fabricated documents claiming their fire was never lost. In one case, a colony in Thrace reportedly bribed a Delphi temple scribe to issue a new flame certification under the original founding date, retroactively legitimizing their relit fire. No one protested. The illusion of continuity mattered more than the reality. As one satirist later wrote, "The gods are less concerned with the heat of the fire than with the calm of the paperwork." It's funny because it was true. The quiet end of the flamekeeping era. By the Hellenistic period, as cities grew and civic religion waned, many central hearths fell into neglect. Temples still burned ritual fires. Homes kept domestic hearths, but the idea of a single, unbroken, public flame faded, replaced by metaphors, poetry, and nostalgia. In Pergamon, a later historian notes, "They say our hearth has burned since Phalteros. I have seen it. It is cold, but the story is warm." By the 2nd century BCE, hearthkeeping as a civic role had all but disappeared in many regions. Only Delphi, Athens, and a handful of sanctuaries maintained the tradition, largely symbolic, often ceremonial. In 112 BCE, a scribe at the Eleusinian Mysteries copied this line into a hymn, "Blessed is she whose flame is ash, for still the smoke remembers." That's how most remembered Hestia, as a symbol, a ritual, a name spoken over bread, wine, and fire long after the bureaucrats had retired. Final reflection. Of all the gods, Hestia demanded the least: no temples, no statues, no temples of war or conquest, just a fire. A quiet fire. But around that fire rose entire cities, bureaucracies, supply chains, and responsibilities. An entire class of civic workers, unnoticed, unsung, made sure that warmth continued, that rituals had a beginning, that treaties had a witness, that homes had a heart. And when that fire flickered or failed, the city paused, humbled, and tried again. This is boring history, the history of coal tenders, scroll writers, and ash-stained tunics. But without it, the rest of history would have had no place to begin. Story 6. The one time Zeus tried farming. Zeus is not typically associated with patience. He thunders. He throws bolts. He acts with immediacy, quick to anger, quick to punish, and quicker still to demand tribute. But there is one forgotten fragment of myth half lost in Hesiod, muddled in late Orphic glossaries, in which the king of the gods tried something wholly unfamiliar. He tried to farm. This is not the tale of his mighty victories or liaisons with nymphs. This is the story of tools, furrows, and the quiet humbling of power before the earth. It is a story preserved not in great temples but in the edge margins of agricultural texts, and whether or not it happened is less important than what it reveals about how the Greeks viewed work, land, and divine embarrassment. The setting, a year without tribute. According to an obscure passage in the Fragments of the Raconthean Log, a rare agricultural manuscript attributed to a scribe from Boeotia, the story begins during a particularly lean year, sometime around the end of the heroic age. There had been drought in Attica, frost in Thessaly, a fire in the barley fields of Megara. The mortal king, stretched thin, sent no grain to Olympus. Olympian offerings were always tied to the harvest. Without barley and oil pressed from olives, sacrifices faltered, libations went dry, altars were swept but not lit. And Zeus, used to overflowing amphorae of wine and heaping piles of roasted meats, was displeased. His ire, according to the log, was thunderous, but Poseidon, unusually restrained, offered counsel. Perhaps you should grow your own, brother. If mortals cannot feed the gods, let gods learn the work of mortals. It was a joke, a barb, but Zeus, rarely one to decline a challenge, even a sarcastic one, took it seriously. He declared that he would raise a crop, from seed to harvest, without divine shortcuts. A year of mortal labor, done by immortal hands. The plot of land. Zeus selected a field on the slopes of Mount Lycaon, a sacred peak in Arcadia, believed to be one of his earliest cult centers. The soil was rocky, the terrain dry, the sun harsh. Perfect, he claimed, for demonstrating mastery. He chose to plant olives, the most respected, stubborn, and symbolic crop in Greek culture. An oracle allegedly warned him. The olive bends for time, not for thunder. He ignored it. The tools of a god. One might imagine that Zeus would simply conjure a plow or cause olives to sprout from bare rock. But true to his word, he insisted on using only mortal methods. So he descended into the Peloponnesian lowlands and visited the workshop of a blacksmith named Telarchos. There, he ordered a bronze hoe, a wooden-handled mattock, a curved sickle for trimming branches, a sack for seeds, empty for now. The blacksmith, not recognizing his customer disguised in plain tunic, beard uncombed, asked simply, "Which fields?" Zeus replied, "The kind that haven't listened in a while." The tools were clumsy in his hands. He was used to scepters, not spades, but he returned to Lycaon and set to work. The first furrow. Plowing is not romantic. It requires rhythm, strength, a sense of soil and slope. Zeus had none of these. He struck the ground in bursts of impatience, dug too shallow, then too deep, overturned stones, broke his first hoe on the third day. A satyr watching from the trees offered advice. If you shout at the dirt, it will only grow louder weeds. Zeus nearly smote him on the spot, but he stayed his hand. That too was part of the promise. Over weeks his rows improved. He learned to spot worm sign, to water in the cool of the evening. He tied cloth around his wrists to avoid blisters. For the first time in his eternal life, Zeus experienced sweat earned, not summoned. The mountains, silent, did not applaud. But the olive saplings, thin, gray-green wisps, emerged in late spring. The thunderer humbled. Tending olives is a long game. They take years to fruit, decades to mature. By midsummer, Zeus was learning what farmers had always known. You do not command plants, you collaborate with them. He spoke less, swore less, learned to wait. Birds nested near the field. A shepherd began bringing goats nearby. Mortals, unaware of the farmer's true identity, began calling him Old Alcios, a hermit with strong shoulders and strange ideas about lightning. One boy brought bread. One girl asked, "Why don't you go to war like other men?" He answered, "Because I am trying to grow something that stays." Earthquake and trial. Then came the quake. Late in the season, Arcadia shook. Stones fell. A landslide buried 2 rows of saplings. Zeus, standing over the wreckage, wept. This was not divine rage. This was the weary silence of someone who had done everything right and still lost. He could have called rain, sun, or resurrection. Instead, he began again, dug new holes, transplanted what he could, rebuilt the stone terraces by hand. In that moment, he was not a god. He was a farmer. But did the trees ever bear fruit? And what became of old Alcios once the year turned? The olive is a patient teacher. It does not rush, does not bloom on command, and cannot be compelled by the threats of kings or gods. In the forgotten year when Zeus farmed the slopes of Mount Lycaon, he learned this not through myth, but through monotony, the repetition of seasons, the language of soil, the quiet calculations of growth. Old Alcios, as the mortals knew him, had traded thunder for waiting, and though his muscles ached and his beard grew wild and gray-streaked, he had not yet seen fruit. But as we shall see, it wasn't about the olives. Not really. The long summer. By the time midsummer settled over Arcadia, Zeus had settled into routine. He rose before the sun, drew water from a cracked cistern using a wooden pulley, checked each olive sapling, brushing dust from leaves, counting buds, removing the weeds by hand. He no longer cursed the worms or scolded the crows. He had learned that the earth did not answer to impatience. The only divine intervention allowed in this endeavor was time, and even that moved sluggishly. From a mortal perspective, the grove was modest. 3 neat rows, a mix of koroniki and wild olive cuttings taken from nearby hills. No walls, no signposts, just a slope of stone-bordered terraces and a man working it silently. What few passers-by came by offered small things. A boy brought figs in exchange for stories. A widow offered to trade eggs for olive branches, for smoke rituals. A wandering poet slept one night by the fire and said, "You swing a hoe like a priest swings incense." Old Alcios simply nodded. The Festival of Winds. That year the winds turned early. In late Bodromian, the Greek September, the seasonal northern wind swept over the Peloponnese with unexpected force. Dust storms gathered, saplings bent, leaves turned silver and shivered like prayer flags. Zeus, worried, stayed through the night at the grove. He built windbreaks from old cart wheels and sod, piled stones at the base of the trees, prayed not to himself, of course, but to the Earth Mother Gaia. There's irony in that, the king of Olympus pleading with the ground for mercy. But no lightning flashed, no voice answered. Only the wind howled, and the trees endured. When the sun rose, he found only 2 broken branches. The rest stood. He didn't smile, but he did pause for a full breath and whisper, "Good." Lessons in insects and irritation. Farming teaches observation. A yellowing of leaves meant magnesium deficiency. Black scale on bark called for careful scraping. A small army of aphids one week brought out ladybugs, the next nature's gentle regulators. Zeus cataloged all of this in a leather-bound journal he had made from goat hide. His handwriting was clumsy but legible. An excerpt, still preserved in the Raconthean log, reads, Day 182, western slope more shaded than expected, fruitless still, aphid colony appearing. Note, do not swat bees near saplings, they are not the problem. The idea that a god wrote those words seems absurd. But the more time passed, the less he resembled a god. Mortals now greeted him not with awe but with respect. They brought him gossip about crop prices, marriage disputes, temple taxes. Zeus listened. He never offered thunder, only nods. In time, some whispered that he had been cursed with humility. Others claimed he was a retired hero. A few suggested he might be a minor spirit who had taken on a mortal shell for penance. No one guessed the truth. A visit from Hermes. As autumn crept over the land, a visitor appeared at dusk. Hermes, god of travelers, commerce, and mischief, descended not with a flourish but with a quiet step. He found Zeus hauling compost from a barrel behind his shack. "Father," he said gently, "they're beginning to ask questions in Olympus." Zeus didn't stop working. "Let them ask." Hermes sat on a nearby rock. "It's been a full mortal year. That was the promise." Zeus nodded. "And the fruit?" Hermes shrugged. "Still none. You picked the wrong tree." Zeus smiled faintly. "I picked the right lesson." They were silent a while, watching dusk paint the mountain violet. Hermes finally said, "Will you return?" Zeus replied, "In time, but first I want to see if it blooms." It didn't, not that year. But that didn't seem to matter anymore. The olive that didn't grow. It's important to note, Zeus's olive grove never bore fruit. Not in the year of labor, not the next spring, not even, as far as records show, in any following generation. And yet the grove was preserved. The people of Lycaon built a small altar on the edge of the plot. No grand temple, just a flat stone, a single inscription. To the one who waited. For centuries it was tended by local farmers. No great myths grew around it, no festivals were held, but every season someone pruned the trees, lit a fire, left offerings of oil and bread. It wasn't for Zeus. It was for the land, for patience, for a god who once tried to understand what it meant to coax life from dirt. But how did Zeus explain his absence when he finally returned to Olympus? And what did the other gods learn, if anything, from his quiet year of work? When Zeus returned to Olympus after his year of farming on Mount Lycaon, he did not do so in triumph. There was no parade, no proclamation. He arrived in the late morning, shoulders broader than before, tunic patched with the kind of care mortals give to things they cannot replace. The dust of the mountains still clung to his sandals. In his hands, he carried a single object, a small, curved olive branch wrapped in linen cutting from a tree that had not yet fruited. The gods looked at him strangely. He was not quite changed, but something had quieted within him. This final chapter explores what happened when the king of the gods came back from his sabbatical as a farmer, and how the other immortals reacted to his experiment in humility, patience, and futility. Divine reception. Hera, goddess of marriage and his long-suffering queen, was the first to speak. She did not ask about the field. She did not ask about the tree. She asked only, was it worth it? Zeus, still holding the branch, replied, yes. She said nothing more, which was, in Hera's way, a gesture of profound respect. Apollo was less impressed. There were no songs, no harvest, no shrine. What did you gain? Zeus answered, a furrow holds more wisdom than a lyre string. Dionysus, overhearing this, remarked, that's the most boring thing you've ever said. I like it. Hestia, ever quiet, simply rose from her hearth, walked to him, and kissed his dusty forehead. The message was clear. You are home, but not the same. The council debates. Later that week, the Olympian council met, a rare formality, but one triggered by the king's unexplained absence. Poseidon, full of salt and sarcasm, opened the discussion. He left without a plan. He returns with a stick. Are we to pretend the clouds did not drift too long without steering? Athena, voice like flint, cut through. He governed from humility. For once, he ruled by example, not by decree. Hermes chimed in. The mortals loved him more as a farmer than they ever feared him as a storm. Ares predictably snorted. He should have tilled a battlefield, not a garden. But the argument, in truth, was symbolic. No one truly believed Zeus had abandoned his post. The seasons had turned. Storms had still rolled across the Aegean. Someone, perhaps a projection, perhaps delegated thunder, had filled the gap. What mattered was the message. If even Zeus could bend to the pace of plants, what excuse had the rest of them? Seeds among the mortals. Though the olive grove never bore fruit, its story spread. Not loudly, not through epics or temples, but in the side passages of agricultural texts, in local prayers whispered during planting, in offerings of oil made not to Zeus the king, but to Zeus the planter, Zeus Georgos. A few rare inscriptions, scattered across Boeotia and Arcadia, bear this title. It was never a major cult. No grand altars rose in its name. But when plowmen sharpened their blades or when rains failed to come, a few would mutter, "May the patience of the thunderer steady my hand." In a rural village near Tegea, a tiny clay figurine was found, a bearded man in a tunic, holding a sickle. The style is archaic. The back bears a scratch mark. Z epsilon upsilon sigma, gamma epsilon omega rho gamma omicron sigma. No lightning bolt, no eagle, just a sickle and a gaze. It's almost certainly him. A change in the god. Zeus resumed his duties as cloud bringer, oath keeper, and king of the divine. But those who watched him closely noticed small changes. He spoke more slowly in council. He listened longer to mortals in prayer. He ordered fewer punishments and more second chances. He instituted a new rite, the autumn libation, where wine and oil were offered not in thanks for harvest, but in acknowledgement of failure and effort. It was a small shift, but for immortals, small shift echo for centuries. Even Ares begrudgingly once said, "He doesn't bark as much. Maybe the olive softened his teeth." Reflections on failure. Years later, in a rare moment of candid speech preserved in the fragmentary tablets of Phantos, Zeus is said to have remarked, "I did not fail at farming. I failed at yielding fruit. These are different things." He continued, "The olive asks no promises. It gives when it wishes. What I learned with my hands in the soil was that labor is its own offering." This is the crux of the myth, if we can call it a myth at all. That effort without reward is still sacred. That even gods must sometimes attempt things not because they are guaranteed to succeed, but because they are worth doing slowly. Zeus the farmer failed at harvesting olives. But he harvested something else, humility. And that was enough. The final offering. At the edge of the grove on Mount Lycaon, there is still a patch of old olive trees. Most have died or been replaced by wild growth. But one gnarled tree, twisted with age, its trunk cracked but alive, still stands. Locals say it never fruits, but its leaves stay green all year. At its base, every few years, someone places a small sickle carved of wood. No name, no marker, just a sign that someone remembered. Maybe it's tradition, maybe it's a joke. Maybe it's an old god visiting a promise he made to himself.